On Christmas morning, 1989, three children disappeared from a small town in rural Pennsylvania while their parents slept. No signs of struggle, no ransom demand, no bodies ever found. For 35 years, their fate remained a mystery wrapped in holiday cheer and unspoken dread. But when a demolition crew tears down an abandoned church in 2024, they discover something hidden in the walls, something that suggests the children never left town at all. What really happened on that Christmas morning, and why did an entire community choose to forget? If you're fascinated by true crime mysteries and unsolved disappearances, subscribe now. You won't want to miss how this ends. The snow fell thick and silent over Millbrook, Pennsylvania on Christmas Eve, 1989. Main Street twinkled with colored lights strung between lampposts, and wreaths hung on every shop door. The Methodist church bell tower rose above the town square, its white steeple pointing toward a gray sky heavy with winter. Inside the rectory beside the church, Reverend Thomas Whitmore sat alone in his study, the only light coming from a small desk lamp. His hands trembled as he wrote in a leather journal, his pens scratching urgently across the page. Outside his window, he could see families hurrying home through the snow, arms laden with last-minute gifts. Children laughed and called to each other, their voices muffled by the thick blanket of white covering the ground. The Reverend paused, staring at what he had written. Then, with a sudden violence that made the lamp flicker, he tore the page from the journal, folded it carefully, and placed it inside an envelope. He sealed it with wax, pressing his signet ring into the warm red pool. For a long moment he held the envelope, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or curse. He stood and crossed to the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the study. The fire had burned down to embers, but he could still feel its heat. He should burn the envelope, he knew, destroy the evidence of what he knew, what he had seen, but his hand would not obey. Instead, he walked to the far wall and ran his fingers along the wooden paneling until he found a specific board. It came loose easily, revealing a hollow space behind the wall. He placed the envelope inside, replaced the board, and stepped back. The church bell began to toll midnight. Christmas Day had arrived. Reverend Whitmore returned to his desk and picked up his pen once more, but this time his hand was steady as he wrote a different kind of message, one that would be found on his desk the next morning when he failed to appear for Christmas service, a message that would raise questions but provide no answers. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering tracks and secrets alike. The demolition crew arrived at the old Methodist church on a Tuesday morning in March 2024. The building had stood empty for 15 years, ever since the congregation merged with the Baptist church across town and moved to a newer facility. The stone structure had deteriorated badly, its roof partially collapsed, windows broken by vandals and time. The town council had finally voted to tear it down and turn the lot into a small park. Marcus Webb stood at a safe distance, watching the excavator's mechanical arms swing toward the church's east wall. He was the site supervisor, a man in his 50s who had demolished dozens of old buildings across 3 counties. Nothing about this job seemed unusual to him, just another decrepit structure that had outlived its purpose. The excavator's bucket struck the wall with a grinding crash. Stones tumbled, dust billowed, and the wall began to collapse inward. Marcus had seen this happen 100 times, but what he hadn't seen before was his operator, Danny Chen, suddenly shutting down the machine and climbing out of the cab with a white face. "Boss," Danny called, his voice tight, "you need to see this." Marcus approached, annoyed at the interruption. They had a schedule to keep. But when he reached the partially demolished wall, he understood why Danny had stopped. Through the settling dust, Marcus could see into a hollow space that had been sealed inside the wall, and there, arranged carefully on a wooden shelf, were 3 small pairs of shoes. Children's shoes, old and dusty, but still intact. Beside them sat 3 small backpacks, the kind elementary school kids might carry. "Don't touch anything," Marcus said quietly, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the police." While they waited, Marcus moved closer, careful not to disturb the scene. The hollow space was perhaps 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, built deliberately into the wall's structure. The shoes were arranged neatly in a row, a pair of red sneakers with white laces, a pair of worn brown boots, and a pair of small white church shoes with a buckle. Each pair was small, sized for children no older than 10 or 11. The backpacks were faded and covered in dust, but he could still make out cartoon characters on 2 of them. The third was plain blue canvas. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March wind. This wasn't random trash that had somehow gotten sealed in a wall. This was deliberate. This was a hiding place. 2 patrol cars arrived within 15 minutes, followed shortly by a white sedan. Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to Danny, had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 20 years. She approached the wall with the careful attention of someone who understood that scenes like this could change everything. "Nobody's touched anything?" she asked, pulling on latex gloves. "No, ma'am," Marcus confirmed. "We saw it and called immediately." Sarah stepped through the gap in the wall, using her flashlight to examine the hollow space. She photographed the shoes and backpacks from multiple angles before carefully lifting the first backpack, the one with cartoon characters. She unzipped it slowly. Inside were school papers, a lunchbox, and a small toy car. She turned one of the papers toward the light. At the top, in a child's careful handwriting, was a name, Tommy Patterson. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had lived in Millbrook her entire life. She knew that name. Everyone in Millbrook over a certain age knew that name. "Get the state police on the phone," she said to one of the patrol officers, "and find out if Captain Morrison is still alive." The officer looked confused. "Morrison retired 20 years ago, Detective." "I know," Sarah replied, still staring at the name on the paper. "But he was lead investigator on a case in 1989, 3 children who disappeared on Christmas Day. Their names were Tommy Patterson, Rebecca Oakes, and Michael Chen." Danny, the excavator operator, made a small sound. "Chen? That's my family name." "I know," Sarah said softly. "Michael was your uncle. You never met him because he vanished when he was 9 years old, 6 months before you were born." She carefully examined the other 2 backpacks, confirming what she already knew she would find: personal belongings of Rebecca Oakes and Michael Chen. 35 years after they disappeared, their possessions had been found sealed inside a church wall, deliberately placed there, hidden with care. "Why would someone hide their things here?" Marcus asked. "And where are the children?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was staring at something else she had noticed, a small gap at the back of the hollow space. She shone her light into it and saw that it opened into a larger void, a space that ran down behind the wall toward the church's foundation. The light didn't reach the bottom. "We're going to need a forensics team," she said, "and we're going to need to take down the rest of this wall very carefully. I think there's more down there." As her team began securing the scene, Sarah stepped away to make phone calls. Her first call was to the state police. Her second was to the 3 families who had spent 35 years wondering what happened to their children. As she dialed the first number, she looked back at the church. The building had stood here for 100 years, a place of worship and community gathering. But now she wondered what other secrets it had kept, sealed behind its stone walls, hidden in the darkness where no one thought to look. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the demolition site. Workers stood in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Everyone in Millbrook over the age of 40 remembered Christmas 1989. The day had become a scar on the town's memory, something people mentioned in whispers or avoided discussing. Altogether, 3 children vanished without explanation, their faces on missing posters that yellowed and faded but never came down. And now, after 35 years of silence, the church was finally beginning to speak. Linda Patterson stood at her kitchen window, washing the same plate for the 3rd time without realizing it. She was 71 now, her hands marked with age spots, her hair completely white, but her eyes were the same sharp blue they had been 35 years ago when she last saw her son, Tommy. The phone call from Detective Chen had come 2 hours ago.
Linda had listened in silence, her grip tightening on the receiver till her knuckles went pale. They found something at the old church, Tommy's backpack, his belongings. After the detective finished speaking, Linda thanked her calmly and hung up. Then she walked to the kitchen and began washing dishes, the only thing she could think of to do with her shaking hands. Her husband, Robert, sat at the kitchen table behind her, his face buried in his hands. He had retired for 6 years, but the news had aged him another decade in minutes. Minutes Elliot, their daughter, stood in the doorway, her own eyes red from crying. She had been 13 when Tommy disappeared, old enough to remember everything, old enough to never stop missing her little brother. "We should go down there," Claire said quietly, "to the church." "The detective said to wait," Robert replied, his voice hollow. "They're still processing the scene." Linda finally set down the plate and turned to face her.
Through them carefully until she found what she was looking for. A program from the Christmas pageant printed on cheap paper that had yellowed with age. The front showed a drawing of the church with snow falling around it. Inside was a list of participants. Linda scanned the names until she found Tommy's. Shepherd, Tommy Patterson. Below his name was Rebecca's angel, Rebecca Oakes. And further down she saw Wise Man, Michael Chen. All 3 missing children had been in the Christmas pageant. All 3 had been at the church for rehearsals in the weeks before they disappeared, and Reverend Whitmore had been directing the pageant. Linda's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and took a photo of the program. She sent it to Detective Chen with a message. All 3 children were in the Christmas pageant rehearsals at the church. Reverend Whitmore was in charge. The response came quickly. "Can you come to the station tomorrow morning at 9, bringing in the other families too? We need to go through everything from 1989. Linda looked around Tommy's room at the faded posters on the walls and the toys gathering dust on the shelves. For 35 years she had maintained this space, unable to let go, unable to move forward. She had been frozen in time, just like these belongings, waiting for answers that never came. Now, finally, the ice was beginning to crack. She didn't know what they would find beneath it, but anything was better than the eternal winter of not knowing. She returned downstairs, where Robert and Claire waited anxiously. "They want us at the station tomorrow morning," she told them. "All 3 families. They're reopening the investigation." Robert stood and wrapped his arms around her. They held each other in the kitchen, where they had held each other so many times before, on anniversaries of the disappearance, on Tommy's birthday each year, on Christmas mornings that arrived with cruel regularity. But this time felt different. This time they were not just holding each other through grief, they were holding each other through something new, the terrifying possibility of truth. Outside, the March afternoon was fading into evening. Across town, in 3 separate houses, 3 families were having similar conversations, feeling similar emotions. The wound that had never healed was being reopened, and nobody knew whether what lay beneath would bring healing or only deeper pain. At the demolition site, portable lights had been set up as forensic technicians continued their careful excavation. Detective Chen stood watching them work, her coat pulled tight against the evening chill. They had widened the opening in the wall and discovered that the hollow space did indeed extend downward. What they found at the bottom would determine everything that came next. A young technician emerged from the gap in the wall, his face pale in the harsh artificial light. "Detective, you need to see this." Sarah followed him back through the opening, descending a temporary ladder into the space beneath. The hollow area was larger than she had expected, a deliberately constructed chamber about 6 feet square. Her flashlight swept across the space, revealing more items carefully arranged on makeshift shelves. 3 small blankets folded neatly, 3 plastic cups, a deck of playing cards, a flashlight with dead batteries, and carved into the stone wall, barely visible beneath decades of dust, were 3 sets of initials, TP, RO, MC. Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a hiding place for belongings. This was a place where children had been kept. The blankets, the cups, the playing cards, these were items for living, not dying. Someone had imprisoned these children here, in a chamber beneath the church, close enough to the surface that they might have heard the organ playing and the congregation singing, yet utterly hidden from view. "Get ground-penetrating radar out here," she ordered. "I want to know if there are any more hollow spaces in this foundation. And get me everything we have on Reverend Thomas Whitmore, every record, every document, every photograph. I want to know everything about the man who ran this church in 1989. As she climbed back out of the chamber, her phone buzzed with a text from Captain Morrison, now 83 years old but still sharp as ever. "Heard the news. I'm coming down tomorrow. There are things about that case you need to know, things I couldn't prove back then." Sarah looked back at the church, its Gothic architecture looming against the darkening sky. The building had seemed noble and peaceful when she was a child, attending services with her parents. Now it looked sinister, its empty windows like blind eyes, its tower reaching up like an accusing finger. Somewhere in or beneath this building were the answers to what happened on Christmas Day, 1989. And Sarah suspected that when they finally uncovered the truth, it would be darker than anyone in Millbrook had ever imagined. The Millbrook Police Department conference room smelled of old coffee and anxiety. Detective Sarah Chen had arranged chairs around a long table, placing boxes of tissues at intervals along its length. She knew from experience that conversations like this one would need them. The three families arrived within minutes of each other at 9 sharp. Linda and Robert Patterson came first, their daughter Claire between them like a bridge connecting two people who had drifted apart over decades of shared grief. Margaret Oakes arrived alone, her husband having passed away 8 years earlier from a heart attack that Margaret always said was really caused by a broken heart. David and Susan Chen laughed last, David moving slowly with a cane, Susan's face carefully composed in the way of someone who learned to mask pain as a survival skill. They took their seats slowly, these people who had once been close friends, but gradually separated, unable to bear the weight of each other's sorrow on top of their own. Sarah noticed how they avoided eye contact at first, then slowly began to acknowledge each other with small nods and sad smiles. "Thank you all for coming," Sarah began, remaining standing at the head of the table. "I know this is difficult, but we need to go through everything from the beginning. The discovery at the church has given us our first real evidence in 35 years, and I believe we finally have a chance to learn what happened to Tommy, Rebecca, and Michael." She opened a laptop and projected an image on the wall, a photograph of the hollow chamber beneath the church, showing the arranged belongings, the blankets, the carved initials. Linda Patterson gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Margaret Oakes began to cry silently. David Chen's face turned to stone, while Susan gripped her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. "You're saying someone kept them prisoner under the church?" Robert Patterson's voice shook with barely controlled rage. "For how long?" "We don't know yet, but we're going to find out." Sarah advanced to the next slide, showing the Christmas pageant program that Linda had sent her. All 3 children were involved in the church Christmas pageant. "Tell me about the rehearsals." Margaret spoke first, her voice thick with tears. "They started in early December, every Wednesday evening at 6 o'clock. The children were so excited about it. Rebecca practiced her lines every night at dinner. Tommy, too," Linda added. "He took it very seriously, said Reverend Whitmore told them they were doing God's work." "How did the children seem during those rehearsals?" Sarah asked. "Did they ever mention anything unusual? Anyone who made them uncomfortable?" The families exchanged glances. Finally, Susan Chen spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael had nightmares in December. 3 or 4 times he woke up crying, but he wouldn't tell us what they were about. He just said he dreamed about the church." Sarah leaned forward. "Did you ask Reverend Whitmore about it?"
"We did," David Chen confirmed. "He said it was normal for children to feel anxious about performing in front of people. He seemed concerned, asked if Michael wanted to drop out of the pageant, but Michael insisted he wanted to stay in it." "Tell me about Christmas Eve," Sarah said, "the last time you saw your children." The room fell silent. This was the memory they had all revisited 1,000 times, searching for clues they might have missed, details that could have changed everything. Linda spoke first, her voice distant as she traveled back through time. "Tommy went to bed at 8. We had a tradition of opening one present on Christmas Eve, and he'd chosen new pajamas, red flannel with snowflakes. He was so excited about Christmas morning. We read him a story, kissed him goodnight, and closed his door." She paused, swallowing hard. "When we checked on him at 7 the next morning, his bed was empty. The window was open. There were no footprints in the snow outside, because it had snowed again overnight, covering everything." Margaret nodded. "Same with Rebecca. She went to bed at 8:30. We heard her moving around in her room until about 9, then silence. When I went to wake her up Christmas morning, she was gone. Window open, curtains blowing in the cold air." "Michael's window was open too," Susan confirmed. "We thought he'd run away at first. He'd had those nightmares, and we wondered if he'd been sleepwalking. But there was something strange we noticed later, something that never made sense." Sarah waited, her pen poised above her notepad. "His winter coat was still in the closet," Susan continued. "His boots were by the door. If he left on his own, he went out in his pajamas and bare feet in the middle of a snowstorm. What child would do that?" "Unless they didn't leave willingly," Sarah said quietly. "Unless—"
Real pageant never happened because the children were missing and Reverend Whitmore had disappeared. He planned this, Robert Patterson said, his voice hollow. He chose them for those specific roles. He took them after the rehearsal because he had everything ready. The chamber, the supplies, whatever twisted plan he had. "We're operating on that theory," Sarah confirmed. "Captain Morrison is coming in this afternoon. He was the lead investigator in 1989, and he says there are things about Reverend Whitmore that he couldn't prove at the time, but always suspected." She advanced to another slide, showing a photograph of Thomas Whitmore. He was a man in his mid-50s with thinning gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a gentle face that would have inspired trust. He wore the black shirt and white collar of his profession and stood before the church, smiling benignly at the camera. "Did any of you know him well?" Sarah asked. "He seemed like a good man," Margaret said softly. "He'd been at the church for about 3 years when the children disappeared. He visited the sick, helped the poor, gave beautiful sermons. Everyone liked him." "That's what makes people like him so dangerous," Sarah replied. "They hide in plain sight, using positions of trust and authority to access victims." She closed the laptop and sat down, facing the families directly. "I need to prepare you for what we might find as this investigation continues. The forensic team is excavating beneath the church foundation. Ground-penetrating radar has indicated several more hollow spaces. We may find remains." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. These families had spent 35 years in a strange limbo, unable to grieve properly because they had no bodies, no certainty, only absence and questions. The possibility of finally having answers was both a relief and a terror. "Whatever we find," Sarah continued, "whatever truth emerges, I promise you that we will see this through to the end. Your children deserve that. You deserve that." As the families filed out slowly, supporting each other, sharing tissues and quiet words, Sarah remained at the table, looking at the photograph of Reverend Whitmore. Behind that gentle smile and those kind eyes had lurked something monstrous, and she was going to prove it. Captain James Morrison arrived at the police station at 2 o'clock, moving slowly but with the deliberate purpose of a man who had never really retired in his mind. At 83, he was thin and stooped, his face a map of wrinkles, but his eyes remained sharp and clear. Sarah met him in the lobby and was struck by how tightly he gripped her hand when they shook.
"35 years," he said without preamble. "35 years I've waited for this day." They settled in Sarah's office rather than the conference room, a smaller space that felt more appropriate for the conversation they needed to have. Morrison lowered himself carefully into a chair and pulled a worn leather briefcase onto his lap. From it, he extracted a thick folder, its edges soft with age and handling. "This is my personal file on the case," he said, setting it on Sarah's desk. "Everything the official investigation missed, everything I couldn't prove, everything that kept me awake at night for decades." Sarah opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, photographs, and what appeared to be surveillance logs. "You kept investigating after the case went cold?" "I never stopped." Morrison's voice was firm. "Those 3 families deserved answers, and I knew we had missed something. I just couldn't figure out what." He reached across and pulled out a photograph from the middle of the stack. It showed Reverend Whitmore standing with a group of children, all wearing choir robes. The photo was dated 1987, 2 years before the disappearances. "Whitmore came to Millbrook in 1986, Morrison began. "He told the church council he'd been serving at a small parish in western Pennsylvania and wanted a change. His references were excellent, his background check came back clean. The congregation loved him immediately." "But something bothered you about him," Sarah prompted. Morrison nodded slowly. "Nothing I could put my finger on at first, but after the children disappeared and he vanished the next day, I started digging into his past more carefully. That's when things got strange." He pulled out another document, a photocopy of a newspaper article from 1982. The headline read, "Church Fire Claims 3 Lives in Harrisburg." "The parish where Whitmore supposedly served before coming to Millbrook burned down in 1982, Morrison explained. 3 children from the congregation died in that fire. It was ruled accidental, faulty wiring in the basement. But I went to Harrisburg and talked to the fire investigator. He always thought the fire was set deliberately, but he couldn't prove it. And here's the interesting part. The 3 children who died were all in the choir. They had been at choir practice when the fire started." Sarah felt a chill run through her. Whitmore was running the choir? He was the assistant pastor at the time. The investigation found no evidence linking him to the fire, and the pastor who died in it had a much stronger motive. He was having financial troubles and had taken out a large insurance policy on the building. But I tracked down some of the other choir members, now adults, and asked them about Whitmore. Morrison pulled out handwritten notes from what appeared to be interviews. 2 of them told me that Whitmore used to talk about sacrifice, about how God sometimes called certain children to be special vessels of grace, about how suffering purified the soul and prepared it for heaven. "Did you share this with the state investigators?" "Of course I did, but it wasn't enough. Theological discussions aren't evidence. The fire was ruled accidental, and Whitmore had a solid alibi for Christmas Eve. He was at the church rectory preparing for Christmas Day service. Multiple people saw lights on his study until late that night." Sarah frowned, but the rectory is connected to the church. If he had the children in that underground chamber, he could have been moving between the rectory and the church without anyone knowing. Exactly what I thought. So I searched every inch of that church and rectory, looking for evidence of a connection, a hidden passage, anything. I found nothing. He paused, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The day after Christmas, Reverend Whitmore's study was found empty except for a note saying he needed time for spiritual reflection and was leaving on a retreat. His personal effects were gone, his car was gone. We issued a nationwide alert, but Thomas Whitmore vanished as completely as those 3 children. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing this information. "So you believed he took them, but you couldn't prove it, and you couldn't find him." "I believed he took them, kept them somewhere, and did something to them, but I couldn't figure out where. I searched that church, Sarah. I had dogs go through it. We examined every closet, every storage room, every basement corner. We never thought to look inside the walls.
The chamber was too well hidden, Sarah said. Whoever built it knew exactly what they were doing. It would have taken careful planning, probably weeks or months of construction. Morrison pulled out another document, this one a building permit. In the summer of 1989, 6 months before the disappearances, Reverend Whitmore requested permission to do some foundation work in the church basement. Said there were water damage issues that needed addressing. The church council approved, and he hired a contractor to do the repairs. Do we know who the contractor was? A man named Gerald Voss, one-man operation, did odd jobs around the county. I interviewed him twice after the children disappeared. He said he'd reinforced some foundation walls and installed better drainage. Everything seemed legitimate. He died in 1997, car accident. Sarah made notes. So Whitmore could have used that renovation as cover to build the hidden chamber, have someone do legitimate foundation work, then seal off a section for his own purposes. That's my theory, but here's what really kept me up at night. Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping. 4 months after the children disappeared, I got an anonymous letter. No return address, postmarked from Pittsburgh. I've kept it all these years. He pulled a plastic evidence sleeve from the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed text. The shepherd guards his flock in the house of God. They sing for him where no one can hear. He believes he is saving them from a corrupt world. Looked deeper into the foundation of faith. A witness, Sarah repeated. Someone who knew what Whitmore was doing, or someone who was helping him. I investigated every angle. I drove to Pittsburgh and canvassed churches, showed Whitmore's photo around. Nothing. The letter was a dead end, but it confirmed my suspicions. Someone knew the children were in that church. Sarah studied the letter carefully. The language was specific, almost biblical in its phrasing. The shepherd guards his flock. That's what Tommy wrote in his note. Whitmore called himself the shepherd, and he made those children think they were special, chosen. Classic abuser pattern. Isolate them, control them, make them dependent on you for everything, even food and water. But then what happened? Sarah asked. When did they die? How and where are their bodies? Morrison's face grew grave. That's what we need to find out. The chamber where they were kept is too small to have held 3 growing children for very long. Either he moved them somewhere else, or he couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the forensic team at the church site.
Winter plague. By morning, every resident knew that the remains of Tommy Patterson had been found sealed in the church wall, and that 2 more bodies would likely be discovered within hours. The town seemed to hold its collective breath, suspended between grief and horror. Sarah Chen had not slept. After making the calls to the 3 families, after hearing Linda Patterson's wail of anguish that would echo in her nightmares forever, she had returned to the station and begun searching for Thomas Whitmore with renewed urgency. He was no longer just a missing person or suspect. He was a confirmed killer, and she needed to find him. At 8, Dr. Wong called. They had opened the second hollow space. Rebecca Oakes had been found in the same condition as Tommy. Skeletal remains, evidence of prolonged malnourishment, remnants of an angel costume from the Christmas pageant. The third space yielded Michael Chen, his small bones still wearing the tattered remains of clothing from a wise man's costume. The 3 children had been entombed in the walls of the church, each one sealed into their own tiny grave, left to die in darkness while wearing the costumes they had been so excited to perform in. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. Sarah sat at her desk, staring at Reverend Whitmore's photograph, memorizing every line of his face. Captain Morrison had returned to the station and sat across from her, his old hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. "The question now is whether he's still alive," Morrison said. "He would be 91 years old." "People live to 91, Sarah replied, "especially people who've spent 35 years believing they got away with murder." Her computer chimed with an incoming email from the FBI.
She had sent Whitmore's photo and information to their database overnight. The response made her sit up straight. "Morrison, look at this." The email contained a series of flagged incidents from across the country, all involving churches and missing children. None had been definitively connected, but the pattern was striking. A fire in Ohio in 1995 that killed 2 children who sang in the church choir. A disappearance in Montana in 2001. A single child who vanished after serving as an altar boy. Another fire in Nevada in 2008, this time claiming 4 young victims who had been in a church youth group. "He's been moving," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. "Different states, different churches, but the pattern is the same. Children involved in religious activities, deaths by fire or disappearance, and in each case, an assistant pastor or visiting minister who left shortly after the incident." Morrison leaned closer to read the screen. "Do they have names for these ministers?" Sarah clicked through the files. Thomas Wright in Ohio, Timothy Moore in Montana, Theodore Walsh in Nevada. Different names, but look at the initials, TWW, same as Thomas Whitmore. Morrison's jaw tightened. He's been hiding in plain sight, using variations of his real name, moving from place to place, continuing to kill. The FBI never connected them because they happened years apart in different states and the deaths were attributed to different causes. But now that we know what to look for, she began typing rapidly, composing a message to the FBI agent who had sent the file. Her phone rang. It was Dr. Wong again. "Detective, you need to come back to the church. We found something else." When Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, the forensic team had expanded their excavation to include the area beneath what had once been the Reverend's study in the rectory. The building's interior had been largely destroyed by weather and time, but the foundation remained solid. Dr. Wong led her to a section where they had removed several stones from the floor. "We found a hidden compartment under the study," she explained. "It was sealed with a stone that matched the floor perfectly, but the radar picked up the hollow space beneath." They had erected lights around the opening. Sarah knelt and looked down into a space about 4 feet deep. Inside was a leather-bound journal, remarkably well preserved in the dry environment, and beneath it a metal box. "We haven't touched them yet," Dr. Wong said, "waiting for your approval." Sarah nodded, and 2 technicians carefully extracted both items. The journal was thick, its pages yellowed but intact. The metal box was locked, but a small key had been taped to its underside. Sarah pulled on gloves and opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise. "The Journal of Thomas Whitmore, Servant of God, Keeper of the Pure." Her hands trembled slightly as she turned pages, scanning the entries. What she read made her stomach turn. Whitmore had documented everything, not as confessions of crime, but as records of holy work. He believed he was saving children from a corrupt world, purifying them through isolation and suffering, then releasing their souls to heaven before they could be tainted by sin. The entries about Tommy, Rebecca, and Michael were chillingly detailed. He described selecting them for their spiritual purity and innocence. He wrote about the Christmas pageant as a testing ground where he could observe which children were most deserving of salvation. He documented building the hidden chamber during the foundation repairs, describing it as a holy space removed from the corruption of the world. The entries continued after the children were taken. Whitmore recorded their days in the chamber, their prayers, their tears, their gradual weakening. He wrote about teaching them hymns and making them memorize Bible verses. He described their transformation as they became weaker and more compliant. And then, in January 1990, a final entry about each child. "Today, the shepherd joined his flock in eternal peace. His purified soul has ascended." Similar entries for the angel and the wise man followed days later. Sarah had to close the journal for a moment, fighting nausea. Whitmore had documented murdering 3 children and convinced himself it was holy work. Morrison had been reading over her shoulder. "The metal box," he said quietly. "Open it." Sarah used the key to unlock the box.
Inside were identity documents for various identities, all with Whitmore's photograph: Thomas Wright, Timothy Moore, Theodore Walsh, and a dozen others. There was also a current passport for Theodore Winters and a small address book with locations listed by state. "He's been planning this for decades," Sarah said. "Multiple identities, multiple locations. He can move whenever he wants, establish himself in a new church, and start again." She flipped to the back of the address book. The last entry was dated 3 months ago. Blessed Heart Church, Spokane, Washington. Assistant pastor position confirmed. Sarah's phone was in her hand, immediately calling the FBI contact. "I need you to coordinate with Spokane Police. We have a location on Thomas Whitmore. He's using the name Theodore Winters and working as an assistant pastor at Blessed Heart. Consider him extremely dangerous, likely planning to harm children in the congregation." Within an hour, federal agents and Spokane police surrounded the church. Sarah watched via video conference as they entered the small brick building. The sanctuary was empty, as was the office, but in a storage room behind the altar, they found something that made Sarah's blood run cold. 3 small cots, 3 sets of handcuffs attached to the wall, and a shelf stocked with minimal food supplies. "He was setting up again," she whispered. "He's been there 3 months, and he was preparing to take more children." The search of the church revealed that Theodore Winters had not been seen for 2 days. The head pastor reported that Winters had mentioned going on a brief personal retreat. His apartment was empty, his car gone. Sarah slammed her hand on the desk in frustration. "He knew we found the chamber. It's been all over the news. He ran." But Morrison was studying the video feed from Spokane with narrowed eyes. "Look at the storage room again. Tell them to check behind that shelf on the north wall." The agents moved the shelf and found exactly what Morrison expected: a bricked-up section of wall that had recently been disturbed. Behind the bricks was another hollow space, this one empty but clearly prepared. "He was going to do it again," Morrison said. "Same pattern, same method, but this time we found him first." Sarah issued a nationwide alert for Theodore Winters, a.k.a. Thomas Whitmore. His photo was sent to every police department, every border crossing, every airport. The FBI's most wanted list was updated, but she knew from experience that a man who had evaded capture for more than 35 years would not be easy to find. Her phone rang again. This time it was the Spokane police with news that sent electricity through the investigation. "We found his car. It's parked at the bus station. We're reviewing security footage now." An hour later, they had it. Clear video of an elderly man matching Whitmore's description, purchasing a bus ticket. The destination made Sarah's heart sink. Millbrook, Pennsylvania. "He's coming back," she said to Morrison. "After 35 years, he's coming home." Morrison's face was grim. "He wants to see his work. Killers like him they can't resist. He needs to know if we found the children, if we understand what he did." Sarah immediately contacted the Millbrook police chief and arranged for additional security at the church site and protection for the 3 families. She also requested that state police set up checkpoints on major roads into town. As she made arrangements, her mind raced through the implications. Whitmore was 91 years old and probably not in.
The next morning arrived cold and gray, with fog rolling through the streets like something from a Gothic novel. Sarah positioned officers around the bus station, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes. She wanted Whitmore to feel safe enough to disembark, but surrounded enough that he couldn't run. At 6:10, the bus pulled into the station. Sarah watched from inside the terminal building, her hand resting on her service weapon. The passengers began to exit: a young woman with a backpack, a businessman with a briefcase, a mother with 2 children, and then, moving slowly with a cane, an elderly man descended the bus steps. He wore a long, dark coat and a gray fedora. His face was deeply lined, spotted with age, but his eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses were sharp and alert. This was Thomas Whitmore, 35 years older, but unmistakably the man from the photographs.
He paused at the bottom of the steps, breathing in the cold air of his former home. Then he smiled, a small, satisfied expression that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Thomas Whitmore?" she called out, stepping forward with her badge visible. "I'm Detective Sarah Chen with the Millbrook Police Department. You're under arrest for the murders of Tommy Patterson, Rebecca Oakes, and Michael Chen." 4 officers moved in from different directions, surrounding him. Whitmore made no attempt to run. Instead, he looked directly at Sarah with those sharp eyes and spoke in a voice that was surprisingly strong for a man his age. "You found them, then? My flock. I wondered if you ever would." "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Sarah ordered. Whitmore complied slowly, still smiling. "You think you understand what I did, but you don't. You can't. You're too bound by earthly thinking." Sarah handcuffed him herself, making sure they were tight. "You murdered 3 children. There's nothing else to understand." "I saved 3 souls," Whitmore corrected gently, as if teaching a particularly slow student. "I released them from the corruption of this world before sin could take root. They're in heaven now, pure and perfect." "They died slowly, sealed in walls, suffocating in the dark," Sarah said, her voice hard. "You documented it in your journal. You watched them weaken and die, and you called it holy work." Whitmore's smile widened slightly. "You read my journal. Good. Then you know the truth of it. Those children were special. Their parents didn't deserve them, couldn't protect them from the evils of the world. I gave them purpose. I gave them eternity." Sarah fought the urge to respond, to argue with his twisted logic. Instead, she guided him toward the waiting police car. But as they walked, Whitmore continued talking, his voice calm and conversational. "I've been doing God's work for 40 years, Detective. Those 3 were not my first, and they would not have been my last if you hadn't interfered. How many souls do you think I've saved? 20? 30? I've lost count of the angels I've released to heaven." "You're confessing to multiple murders," Sarah said, signaling to an officer to record this. "I'm sharing the truth of my ministry," Whitmore corrected. "In Ohio, I saved 2 young voices from the choir before sin could silence them. In Montana, a boy who served at the altar with such devotion, I preserved that devotion forever. In Nevada, 4 souls released in holy fire, and there have been others, so many others." They reached the police car. Sarah opened the back door, but before she could guide Whitmore inside, he turned to look back at the town square. His gaze settled on the church in the distance, partially demolished but still standing. "I want to see it," he said suddenly. "The church? My church? Before you lock me away, I want to see where my flock rested." "Absolutely not," Sarah replied, but Morrison, who had been listening from a few feet away, stepped forward. "Let him see it," he said quietly, "with supervision, under complete control, but let him see it." Sarah looked at the old captain, understanding immediately. Whitmore would confess everything if they gave him what he wanted. One last look at the scene of his crimes, one last moment of control. And they needed those confessions, needed him to provide details about the other victims, other locations. "Fine," she said, "but you make one wrong move, say one wrong word, and we're done. Understood?" Whitmore nodded, that small smile still playing at his lips. They drove the short distance to the church, arriving just as the morning fog was beginning to lift. The building looked even more ominous in person than it had from a distance, its partially demolished walls like broken teeth against the gray sky. Sarah and 2 other officers escorted Whitmore from the car. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on his cane, but his eyes were bright with something that looked disturbingly like joy. They walked toward the excavation site, where Dr. Wong and her team had erected a tent over the area where the children's remains had been found. "The chamber where you kept them," Sarah said, pointing to the exposed foundation. "We found it exactly as you left it, the blankets, the cups, the carved initials."
Whitmore nodded, his eyes distant. They were comfortable there, safe from the world. I brought them food and water. I taught them prayers and hymns. They understood toward the end what I was giving them. They were terrified, Sarah countered. They wrote notes begging to go home. They counted stones on the walls to pass the time. They were children, and you tortured them. I prepared them for salvation, Whitmore insisted. His voice had taken on a preaching quality, rising and falling with practiced rhythm. Their bodies were temporary vessels. What mattered was their souls, and those I kept pure. Morrison had been watching him carefully. Now he spoke for the first time. The fire in Harrisburg in 1982, the 3 children who died, that was you, wasn't it? Your first time. Whitmore's attention shifted to Morrison, and recognition flickered in his eyes. You never stopped looking for me, did you, Captain Morrison? I could tell, even from a distance, that you understood I was different, special. You're not special, Morrison said flatly. You're a serial killer who hid behind religion. I'm a shepherd who guided his flock to paradise. And yes, Harrisburg was my awakening. I realized then what God wanted me to do. Those 3 children in the choir, they were so innocent, so pure, and I could see how the world was beginning to corrupt them, how their parents were failing them. The fire was meant to take only them, to release only their souls. But the pastor interfered, tried to save them. His death was unfortunate, but necessary. Sarah was recording everything on her phone held discreetly at her side. Every word Whitmore spoke was another piece of evidence, another confession. Tell me about Montana, the boy who served as altar boy. Whitmore's eyes grew distant with memory. Jacob, such a devout child. He believed in God with his whole heart. I couldn't let the world take that faith from him. I kept him for 3 months in a basement beneath the church rectory. We prayed together every day. When it was time, I gave him communion one last time, then helped him breathe his last breath. It was peaceful, sacred. You suffocated him, Sarah said. I released him, Whitmore corrected gently. There's a difference if you have the spiritual understanding to see it. They stood in the cold morning air, this old man calmly confessing to decades of murder, framing each death as an act of love. Sarah felt rage building in her chest, but she kept her voice level, professional. She needed him to keep talking. Nevada, she said, 4 children in a fire. How did you choose them? They were in the youth group I led. 2 boys, 2 girls, ages 8 to 12, perfect ages before adolescence could corrupt them. I'd been preparing a special place for them in the church basement, a room where they could be together, safe from the world. But the head pastor became suspicious, started asking questions about why I spent so much time alone with the children. I realized I had to act quickly. He paused, his expression almost wistful. The fire was beautiful. I locked them in the basement room first, made sure they were comfortable, told them we were playing a special game of hide and seek. Then I started the fire upstairs and left. They never suffered from burns, you understand. The smoke took them gently while they slept. They died terrified and in pain, Morrison said, his voice shaking with controlled fury. Every single child you killed died in fear and agony. For the first time, Whitmore's smile faltered slightly. You don't understand. You can't. You're too bound by earthly thinking. You're right, Sarah said. We don't understand how someone could hurt children and call it love. We don't understand how you could watch them suffer and feel righteous. But we understand justice, and you're going to spend whatever time you have left in prison knowing that everyone sees you for what you really are. Not a shepherd, not a savior, just a monster who hurt the most vulnerable people he could find. Whitmore's face hardened. I want to see where they rested, where my flock was sealed. Sarah nodded to Dr. Wong, who lifted the tent flap. They guided Whitmore closer